A thrilling story of redemption, love, passion, and new beginnings, where a millionaire seduced his daughter's nanny and ended up destroying his own marriage. But before telling this story, subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Continuing. The sun was setting over Chicago, painting the mirrored windows of the Blackwood building golden. On the 40th floor, Edward remained motionless before the panoramic view, his reflection superimposed on the city stretching to the horizon. At 45, he was the personification of success, graying temples giving him a distinguished air, elegant bearing cultivated through decades in high society, and a real estate empire that kept his competitors up at night. His fingers drummed distractedly on the solid mahogany desk while his gaze wandered over the city he had helped shape. Buildings, shopping centers, luxury condominiums all bore the Blackwood mark. It was his legacy, built with iron determination, and as few knew, some decisions he'd prefer to forget. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Heather, his wife. "Edward, don't forget dinner with the Morgans tonight. It's important for the merger." Her voice sounded controlled, professional, as if she were speaking to a business partner instead of her husband of 15 years. "Of course, Heather. I'll be home at 7. He responded automatically, realizing he couldn't remember the last time they'd had a conversation that didn't involve social commitments or business. As he hung up, his eyes landed on the picture frame on his desk, a photo of Isabella, his 5-year-old daughter. Her smile, identical to the one Heather had when they met, provoked a pang of guilt. When had his marriage transformed into a successful business partnership, but emotionally bankrupt? The intercom buzzed, and his secretary's voice announced the arrival of the new nanny for the interview. Edward had promised Heather he would participate in the selection this time, after the last professional quit, claiming Isabella was a difficult child. He knew his daughter wasn't difficult. She was just reacting to her parents' absence, always too busy with their public lives to notice the emptiness growing inside their home. "Send her in, Sandra." The door opened, and Edward felt the air escape from his lungs. The young woman who entered looked nothing like the previous nannies, all hand-picked by Heather, middle-aged ladies with impeccable references and stern expressions. This one was different. Claire Oliveira was 27, as her resume indicated, but her large, expressive eyes carried a maturity that transcended her age. She dressed simply, a light blue dress that enhanced her olive skin, dark hair tied in a discreet bun. But it was her smile, genuine and warm, that captured Edward's attention. "Mr. Blackwood, thank you so much for the opportunity." Her voice was soft, with a slight accent that revealed her humble origins. Edward gestured for her to sit, trying to maintain his professional composure, while a strange, unsettling sensation settled in his chest. "Miss Oliveira, I saw in your resume that you worked for 5 years with the Santos family. Yes, I took care of the twins since they were born. I only left because the family moved abroad." There was a note of longing in her voice that didn't go unnoticed. The interview proceeded, and Edward found himself increasingly intrigued. Claire not only answered questions with intelligence and sensitivity, but also asked her own, about Isabella's personality, her fears, her likes. They were questions he himself should ask more often. "What do you think is most important in a child's development?" Edward asked, surprising himself with his genuine interest in the answer. Claire didn't hesitate. "Consistent love, Mr. Blackwood. Children need to know they're loved not just when they do something right, but especially when they make mistakes. They need someone who truly listens to them, who understands their fears without judging them." The few words hit Edward like a punch to the stomach. How many times had he really listened to Isabella in recent months? How many times had business meetings taken the place of bedtime stories? And do you consider yourself capable of offering this consistent love? The words came out before he could contain them, carrying a weight he didn't intend. Claire's gaze met his, firm and transparent. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood. It's the only way I know how to care for someone." At that moment, something changed in the office air. A subtle tension, almost imperceptible, but definitely present. Edward found himself unable to look away, lost in the honesty of those eyes that seemed to see beyond his carefully constructed facade. "You're hired." The decision was instantaneous, visceral. Heather probably wouldn't approve. Claire was too young, too informal for the family's standards. But for the first time in a long time, Edward felt he was doing something right. Claire smiled and the office seemed to light up. "You won't regret it, Mr. Blackwood. I promise to take care of Isabella as if she were my own daughter." As he watched her leave, Edward couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened, as if fate, in its infinite irony, had chosen that moment to begin crumbling the castle of appearances he had spent years building. The sun had completely set, plunging the city into shadows. Edward picked up his car keys, remembering dinner with the Morgans. Another social event where he and Heather would play their roles as the perfect couple, smiling for the cameras while something slowly died inside. But now, for the first time in years, a small flame of something different burned in his chest, a dangerous feeling of possibility, of life beyond the golden walls of his self-imposed prison. And although he didn't yet know it, that flame was destined to transform into a fire that would consume everything in its path. Driving through the Chicago night, Edward couldn't imagine that this simple decision to hire a nanny would be the first step toward the abyss, an abyss that promised both destruction and redemption, depending on how he chose to fall. Dinner with the Morgans dragged on like an out-of-tune symphony. Heather, impeccable in her emerald green dress, conducted the conversation with the mastery of someone born for social life. Edward observed his wife with a mixture of admiration and sadness. At what point had they become so perfect at pretending? "And how is little Isabella?" asked Carmen Morgan, bringing a glass of expensive red wine to her lips. Heather told me you're having trouble keeping a nanny. Edward felt Heather's warning look. "Actually, I hired a new professional just today, Claire Oliveira. She has excellent references." "Oliveira?" Heather's tone didn't hide her surprise. "I don't remember any Oliveira family in our circle." "Because she doesn't belong to our circle, dear," Edward replied, feeling an inexplicable satisfaction in challenging his wife's expectations. "But she has proven experience and a special way with children." The silence that followed was cutting. Heather maintained her social smile, but her eyes said something else. Edward knew that look. It was the same one she gave him when he suggested spending a family weekend instead of attending some important event. Back at the mansion, they found Isabella still awake, against all the rules established by Heather. The little girl was in the library, surrounded by books scattered on the floor while Claire read aloud, making different voices for each character. "What is the meaning of this?" Heather's voice cut through the air like a razor. "It's past 10 o'clock. Claire rose quickly, adjusting her dress. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm sorry. Isabella was having trouble sleeping. She was anxious about her parents' absence. I thought a story—" "We didn't hire you to make judgments about how we raise our daughter," Heather interrupted, icy. "Just to follow the established rules." Edward observed the scene, torn between the need to keep the peace and an inexplicable desire to defend Claire. That's when he noticed something extraordinary. Isabella, normally shy and withdrawn with strangers, was clinging to Claire's skirt, as if seeking protection. "Mom, please." Isabella's small voice trembled. "Claire tells such beautiful stories." Heather softened her expression when looking at her daughter, but her voice remained firm. "To bed now, Isabella, no discussion." Claire knelt down to be at the girl's height. "Tomorrow we'll continue the story, little one, I promise." Her smile was so genuine, so full of affection, that Edward felt something tighten in his chest. After Isabella was taken to her room, Heather turned to Claire. "We need to establish some boundaries, Miss Oliveira. There are rules in this house." "Yes, ma'am," Claire responded with dignity without lowering her eyes. "But, with all due respect, there are also emotional needs that must be met." Edward watched fascinated as his wife, accustomed to having the last word, was momentarily left without a response. Claire took advantage of the silence to withdraw, leaving behind a soft jasmine perfume that seemed to fill the entire environment. She won't last a week, Heather declared, serving herself a generous shot of whiskey. She's too young, too idealistic. This is no place for people like that. Edward didn't respond immediately. His thoughts were on the scene he had witnessed, on how Claire had transformed the austere library into a magical space, how she had brought life to that environment so lacking in human warmth. Maybe that's exactly what this house needs, he murmured, more to himself than to Heather. The days that followed brought a subtle but noticeable change to the Blackwood mansion. Isabella's laughter, once so rare, began to echo through the corridors. Claire had the gift of transforming everyday tasks into adventures. Homework became games, the garden transformed into an enchanted forest, bath time into an underwater expedition. Edward found himself coming home earlier, eager to witness those small transformations. Sometimes he stopped at the door of the library or garden, observing without being noticed how Claire interacted with his daughter. There was a naturalness, a genuine joy that he hadn't seen in his house for years. One afternoon, returning earlier from the office, he found Claire and Isabella in the backyard. They were sitting on the grass making flower crowns. Claire's simple dress was stained green, and her hair, loose from its usual bun, danced in the breeze. "Daddy!" Isabella ran to him, holding a poorly made daisy crown. "Look what I made!" Edward bent down to receive the gift, aware of Claire's gaze upon them. "It's beautiful, Princess. The most beautiful crown I've ever seen. Claire taught me. She knows how to make a ton of cool things." Isabella's joy was contagious. "She's also teaching me to make friendship bracelets. Want to see?" Before he moved, good answer. Isabella was already pulling him by the hand toward Claire, who remained sitting on the grass, a shy smile on her lips. "Sorry about the mess, Mr. Blackwood." She made a move to stand up, but Edward gestured for her to stay where she was. No Mr. Blackwood in moments like this. He surprised himself with his own words. Edward is sufficient. The look they exchanged lasted only a second, but it was loaded with something indefinable, a kind of mutual recognition, a silent understanding that something was changing. Edward. She repeated his name softly, as if testing it. The sound sent a wave of warmth through his chest. Isabella, oblivious to the tension forming, continued chattering about her artistic creations. Edward sat on the grass with them, letting his daughter place another flower crown on his head, aware of the absurdity of the scene. He, Edward Blackwood, respected businessman, sitting in the garden with flowers in his hair. But for the first time in years, he didn't care about appearances. There was something liberating about simply existing in that moment, about being a father, about laughing with his daughter, about feeling Claire's warm gaze upon him. That's when Heather appeared at the garden door, freezing the scene with her presence. Her gaze moved slowly from her husband sitting on the grass to Claire, and then to the scattered flowers. "Edward, the Montgomerys arrive in an hour for the cocktail party. I need you to be presentable." Her voice was controlled, but her eyes sparkled. The magic of the moment broke. Edward stood up, adjusting his rumpled suit, suddenly aware of how the scene must have appeared. Claire also stood up, quickly gathering the scattered flowers. "Isabella, bath time," Heather ordered. "Miss Oliveira, please make sure she's properly dressed to receive visitors." As he went upstairs to change, Edward couldn't stop thinking about Claire's smile, about the sound of his name on her lips, about the peace he had felt sitting on that grass. It was a dangerous feeling, he knew, a feeling that threatened to destabilize the foundations of his carefully constructed life. But for the first time in a long time, the prospect of change didn't scare him. On the contrary, there was something exciting about the possibility of feeling again, of being more than an empty shell fulfilling social obligations. What Edward didn't know was that Heather, on the other side of the hallway, was observing her. Reflection in the mirror with calculating eyes. She was no fool. She recognized the signs of danger when she saw them. And Claire Oliveira, with her youth and her authenticity, represented a danger she wasn't willing to tolerate. Weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, Claire's presence became more deeply intertwined in the fabric of the Blackwood mansion. It wasn't just Isabella's laughter echoing through the corridors, or the small changes in decoration, vases with fresh flowers, colorful drawings on the walls of the girls' room, storybooks scattered throughout the library. It was something more subtle, deeper, a sense of life that had long abandoned that place. Edward found himself increasingly involved in this transformation. He started coming home earlier, inventing excuses to spend more time with his daughter, and consequently with Claire. The storytelling sessions in the library became a ritual in which he participated whenever he could, sitting in his favorite armchair watching how Claire brought the characters to life with her different voices and expressive gestures. It was on one of these nights that Claire's past emerged for the first time. Isabella had finally fallen asleep on the library sofa, and Edward was helping Claire organize the scattered books. "You have a special gift with stories," he commented, catching himself admiring the way she moved her hands while organizing the volumes. "Where did you learn to tell stories like that?" Claire paused for a moment, a book suspended in the air. Her face took on a distant, almost melancholic expression. "From my grandmother. She raised me and my brothers after our mother passed away. We didn't have much, but every night she would invent stories to help us sleep. She said that as long as we had stories to tell, we would never be truly poor." Edward felt his heart tighten. It must have been difficult. It was, but it was also beautiful, you know. Claire smiled, that smile that lit up her eyes. "I learned that the best things in life can't be bought. Love, stories, moments." Their gazes met over the pile of books, and something electric passed between them. Edward felt his throat dry. "And your brothers?" he asked, trying to keep the conversation on safe ground. "Peter works as a mechanic in Ohio and Mary is a nurse in Atlanta," Claire began to explain, but was interrupted by a noise at the door. Heather was standing at the entrance to the library, her cold eyes assessing the scene. "Edward, we need to talk about the merger with the Morgans." The moment broke like crystal. Claire quickly picked up the sleeping Isabella in her arms, murmuring goodnight before withdrawing. Edward watched her leave, feeling an inexplicable emptiness settle in his chest. "You're getting too involved." Heather's voice was as sharp as, "Heis, it's becoming too obvious. I don't know what you're talking about." Edward responded automatically, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, you do." Heather served herself a shot of whiskey from the library bar. "You think I don't notice your looks, your increasingly earlier arrivals home, your sudden interest in fairy tales?" Edward felt anger growing in his chest. "Maybe I just want to spend more time with my daughter. Ever thought of that?" "Your daughter," Heather laughed, a humorless sound. "Or the nanny who makes you feel young again." The words hit Edward like a slap, not because they were cruel, but because they carried a truth he had been trying to deny to himself. "You're being ridiculous." He headed for the door, but Heather wasn't finished. "You know what's ridiculous, Edward? A man of your position risking everything for a fantasy with a girl who could be your daughter." Edward stopped, his hands closing into fists. "Don't talk about her like that." "Oh, so now you defend her?" Heather took another sip of her drink. "Fascinating how you managed to be so blind to your own actions." That night, Edward couldn't sleep. Lying next to Heather, who pretended to sleep on the other side of the king-size bed, he mentally reviewed every moment with Claire. Every smile, every shared look, every time their fingers accidentally touched when passing a book or a cup of coffee. Heather was right. He was getting too involved. But how to avoid it? How to remain indifferent to the light Claire brought to his grey life? The next morning, Edward found Claire in the garden, helping Isabella plant flowers. The morning sun played in her loose hair, and for a moment he stood, watching how she patiently taught his daughter about seeds and soil. "Daddy," Isabella spotted him first, running in his direction with hands dirty from soil. "Come see what we're planting." Edward approached, aware of the blush that tinged Claire's cheeks when their gazes met. "They're daisies," she explained, her voice soft. "Isabella chose them. She said they're the happiest flowers that exist." "And they are," Isabella declared, with the certainty that only children possess. Claire said they always look at the sun, as if they're smiling. Edward crouched down beside them, pretending to examine the small holes they had made. In reality, he was fighting against the overwhelming desire to touch Claire's face, to feel if her skin was as soft as it looked. "Mr. Blackwood?" Claire's voice brought him back to reality. "Is everything okay?" He realized he had been silent for too long. "Yes, of course. And please, I've already asked you to call me Edward." "I don't think it's appropriate," she responded quietly, but her eyes said something else. The moment was interrupted by Sandra, his secretary, who appeared in the garden. "Mr. Blackwood, the Japanese investors have arrived for the meeting." Edward stood up reluctantly, adjusting his suit. "Duty calls." "Dad, will you come back to see the flowers when they bloom?" Isabella asked, her eyes shining with expectation. "Of course, Princess," he promised, knowing it was just another excuse to be near Claire. As he walked to his office, Edward felt the weight of Claire's gaze on his back. He knew he was playing with fire, that he should keep his distance, establish clear professional boundaries. But for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. What he didn't know was that, at tea, that very moment, Heather was on the phone with her private investigator. "I want everything on Claire Oliveira. Every detail of her life, every secret, every skeleton in the closet. And I want it fast." The sun continued to shine on the garden, oblivious to the dramas unfolding under its light. The daisies would be planted, would grow and bloom, silent witnesses to a love that was beginning to be born. A love that, like the flowers themselves, would seek the light even on the darkest days. The tension in the Blackwood mansion grew, like a storm approaching on the horizon. Heather, armed with the detailed report on Claire, carefully planned her next move. The document in her hands revealed more than she expected, much more. "So Claire Oliveira isn't as immaculate as she seems," Heather murmured to herself, her eyes scanning the pages with growing interest. The report revealed that, 5 years ago, Claire had been briefly involved in a scandal with her former employer, a married businessman. Although the accusations had later been proven false, an attempt by the jealous wife to tarnish the young woman's reputation, Heather knew she could use that information to her advantage. Meanwhile, in the garden, the daisies that Isabella and Claire had planted were beginning to sprout, small green points emerging from the dark soil. Edward spent more and more time there, observing the flowers' progress with an interest that went far beyond gardening. "See, Daddy? They're growing!" Isabella exclaimed, kneeling in the soil, her eyes shining with excitement. "Claire said they'll have flowers soon." Edward smiled, but his eyes were fixed on Claire, who was gently watering the sprouts. The afternoon sun created a golden halo around her, and for a moment he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to touch her hair, to smell her perfume up close. "Mr. Blackwood?" Claire's voice brought him back to reality. "It's time for Isabella's snack." "Edward," he corrected automatically, his voice hoarser than intended. "Please." The blush that tinged Claire's cheeks didn't go unnoticed. She lowered her eyes, but a small smile played on her lips. It was at that moment that Heather appeared in the garden, her presence bringing a sudden change in the atmosphere. "Claire, dear, can we talk for a moment? In private?" Edward felt a shiver of apprehension. He knew that tone of Heather's. It was the same one she used before closing a particularly difficult deal. "Of course, Mrs. Blackwood," Claire replied, cleaning her hands on her apron. "Isabella, go with your father. Daddy will give you your snack today," Heather ordered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Edward hesitated, his instinct screaming that something was wrong, but what could he do? He took Isabella by the hand and led her inside, casting one last concerned look at Claire. In Heather's office, Claire sat rigidly on the edge of the chair, aware of the tension in the air. Heather moved around the environment with the grace of a predator, serving herself a glass of wine before turning to the young woman. "You know, Claire, you intrigue me," Heather began, her voice dangerously soft. "Such a young woman, so dedicated. Almost too dedicated, don't you think?" Claire kept her chin up, though her heart beat rapidly. "I don't understand what you mean, Mom." Heather slid a folder across the desk. Santos Family 2020, remember? The blood drained from Claire's face. That was a misunderstanding. Mrs. Santos later admitted she was mistaken. Oh yes, she admitted. Heather took a sip of wine, savoring the moment. But you know how these things are, where there's smoke. I never, Claire began, but Heather interrupted her with a gesture. I'm not interested in what happened or didn't happen. What interests me is the present. And in the present, dear, you're getting too close to my husband. The words hung in the air like a veiled threat. Claire felt her hands tremble slightly. Mrs. Blackwood, I would never... Spare us the theatre, yes? Heather placed the glass on the desk with a dry clink. You have until the end of the week to find another job. I'll give excellent references, of course, but if you decide to stay... She left the threat hanging in the air. Claire stood up, her legs wobbly. You're making a mistake. I love Isabella. I would never do anything to hurt this family. Love? Heather laughed, a cold and calculated sound. Is that what you tell yourself when you look at my husband? That it's love for the child? The words hit Claire like a slap. Tears threatened to fall, but she bravely contained them. You Kaidu don't know me. Her voice trembled, but there was dignity in her words. And you're judging something pure with eyes stained by your own bitterness. Heather rose slowly, her eyes flashing with anger. Be careful with your words, girl. You have no idea what I'm capable of doing. No, Mrs. Blackwood, you have no idea what you're capable of destroying with your suspicions. Claire headed for the door but stopped before leaving. You know what the difference is between us? I still believe that love can be simple and true. You've turned everything into a power game. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Edward was trying to distract Isabella, but his thoughts were in Heather's office. He knew his wife too well not to worry about that private conversation. Daddy, why is Mommy angry with Claire? Isabella's innocent question caught him by surprise. She's not angry, Princess. It's just a conversation. He lied, hating himself for it. But Mommy had that face, Isabella insisted. The one she makes when she's going to scold someone. Edward felt his heart tighten. How could his 5-year-old daughter be so perceptive? Before he could answer, he heard hurried footsteps. In the hallway. Claire passed by the kitchen without looking inside, but Edward could see she was crying. Finish your snack, dear, he said to Isabella, rising quickly. Daddy will be right back. He found Claire in the garden, by the daisies they had planted. She was on her knees in the soil, her tears falling on the small green sprouts. Claire, he called softly. She didn't turn around. Please, don't come closer. Your wife, she's right. This isn't right. Edward felt as if something was being ripped from his chest. What did Heather say to you? The truth. Claire finally turned to him, her eyes bright with tears. That we're playing with fire. That this can only end in destruction. That's not true. Edward took a step toward her, but she backed away. Yes, it is. Look at us, Edward. Really look. What are we doing? I came here to take care of Isabella, to be a positive presence in her life. And now... Her voice failed. And now? He insisted, his heart pounding in his chest. Now I'm here, in love with her father, destroying a family. The words came out as a sob. This isn't me. I can't be that person. The world seemed to stop for a moment. The confession hung in, the air between them heavy with possibilities and dangers. Edward felt his own mask of control shatter. Claire, Don't say it. She interrupted him, standing up. Please don't say anything. I'm leaving at the end of the week. It's best for everyone. She passed by him, leaving behind only the scent of jasmine and the echo of unspoken words. Edward remained, there among the daisies that were beginning to sprout, feeling his world silently crumble. From the second floor of the mansion, Heather observed the scene with a satisfied smile. Her strategy had worked perfectly, or so she thought, because what she didn't know was that some seeds once planted cannot simply be pulled up. And love, like the daisies in the garden, has the stubborn habit of blooming even in the most unlikely terrains. The next 3 days at the Blackwood mansion were an exercise in silent torture. Claire continued her tasks with professional dedication, but something had changed. There were no more animated stories in the library, no games in the garden. Her interactions with Edward were limited to the strictly necessary, each word measured, each look avoided. Isabella, sensitive to changes as only children can be, began having nightmares. On one of those nights, her screams cut through the mansion's corridors like knives. "No! Don't let her go!" the little girl screamed in her sleep, tears streaming down her small face. Edward was the first to reach the room, followed closely by Claire. Their gazes met briefly in the half-light before turning to Isabella, who was thrashing in bed. "Shh, princess, Daddy's here." Edward sat on the edge of the bed, stroking his daughter's hair. "Claire," Isabella called, still half asleep. "Don't. Let her go, Daddy, please." Edward's heart broke seeing the devastated look on Claire's face. She remained at the door, her hands gripping the fabric of her robe tightly. "I'll handle this." Heather's voice emerged behind them, cold and controlled. "Go back to your room, Miss Oliveira." Claire hesitated for a moment, her eyes fixed on Isabella, before silently withdrawing. Edward felt each of her steps echo in his chest like a blow. The next morning, breakfast was a tense occasion. Heather presided over the table with her usual calculated elegance, while Edward barely touched his food. Isabella, still affected by the nightmare, played sadly with her cereal. "Mommy?" Isabella's small voice broke the silence. "Why does Claire have to leave?" Heather set her coffee cup down with millimetric precision. "Because sometimes, dear, people need to follow their own paths." "But she promised to see the daisies grow with me," Isabella insisted, her eyes filling with tears. Edward couldn't take it anymore. He rose abruptly from the table, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "Excuse me." He found refuge in his office, but even there he couldn't escape, the whirlwind of emotions consuming him. Through the window, he could see the garden where the daisies were beginning to show their first buds. Each forming flower was a reminder of Claire's smile, of the light she had brought to their lives. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Sandra, his secretary, with a concerned expression. "Mr. Blackwood, the merger documents with the Morgans have arrived for your signature." Edward barely registered the words. His eyes had caught a movement in the garden. Claire was there, watering the daisies one last time. Even from a distance, he could see she was crying. "Leave them on the desk, Sandra," he murmured, unable to look away from the scene. When he was alone again, Edward allowed himself to admit a truth he had been denying. He was hopelessly in love with Claire. It wasn't just desire or a midlife fantasy. It was something deeper, truer than anything he had ever felt. The sound of classical music coming from upstairs indicated that Heather was in her morning yoga session. With his heart pounding, Edward went down to the garden. Claire sensed him approaching before she even saw him. Her shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn around. "The daisies," she said softly, "will bloom in a few days. Tell Isabella I'm sorry." "I won't be able to see them. It doesn't have to be this way." Edward's voice came out hoarse, laden with emotion. Claire finally turned to him, her eyes red from crying. "Yes, it does. Your wife is right. I can't be the person who destroys a family." "And what if the family was already destroyed long before you arrived?" The words escaped before he could contain them. "What if you were the only real thing that happened here in years?" "Edward, please." She took a step back, but he advanced, eliminating the distance between them. "Look me in the eyes and tell me you don't feel the same," he challenged, his voice trembling. "Tell me I'm alone in this." "I can't," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "That's the problem. I can't lie about it." The world seemed to stop for a moment. They were so close they could feel each other's breath. Edward raised his hand, hesitant, and touched Claire's face, wiping away a tear with his thumb. It was at that moment they heard Heather's voice. What a touching scene. She was standing at the garden door, still in her yoga clothes, an icy smile on her lips. "Should I applaud?" Claire moved away from Edward as if she had received a shock. Heather descended the garden steps with the grace of a snake about to strike. "You know, dear, when I hired that investigator, I was hoping to find something more scandalous in your past. But this," She gestured to the scene she had just witnessed. This is even better. So melodramatic, so predictable. Heather, enough. Edward tried to intervene, but his wife ignored him. What do you think is going to happen, Claire? Heather continued, her voice distilling venom. That he'll leave everything for you? His wife, his daughter, his fortune, his reputation, for a nanny? Each word was a stab, and Claire received them without defending herself, her eyes fixed on the ground. Or maybe, Heather moved closer, you really believe you're different from the others, that your love is special, pure, true. How pathetic. Enough! Edward's shout echoed through the garden, startling even Heather. That's enough. But the damage was done. Claire raised her eyes, her face a mask of pain and resignation. You're right, she said softly. I resign, right now. Claire, no. Edward tried to reach her, but she dodged him. Goodbye, Mr. Blackwood. The formal use of his name was like a final stab. Tell Isabella that. Her voice failed. Tell her I'm sorry. She turned and ran into the house, leaving behind only the echo of her footsteps and the scent of jasmine mixed with tears. Edward stood still, feeling his world crumble, while Heather smiled satisfied at his side. What none of them noticed was Isabella, hidden behind one of the garden columns, witnessing everything with her childish eyes, but understanding, with a wisdom beyond her years, that something precious had been broken on that sunny morning. The sound of Claire's bedroom door slamming echoed through the mansion like a gunshot. Edward remained in the garden, paralyzed, while Heather calmly returned inside, her posture as victorious as a queen who had just won a battle. The daisies, still in bud, seemed to wilt under the weight of the drama they had witnessed. Daddy? Isabella's small voice brought him back to reality. She came out from behind the column, her large eyes full of unshed tears. Why was Mommy so mean to Claire? Edward felt his heart break even more. How to explain to a 5-year-old child the complexities of adult love, of a failed marriage, of appearances that needed to be maintained at all costs? Sometimes, Princess, he began, kneeling to be at her height, adults do things that hurt other people without realizing how wrong they are. But Claire didn't do anything wrong, Isabella protested, her voice trembling. She only makes us happy. The truth in the innocent observation hit Edward like a punch to the stomach. That was it. Claire had brought happiness to their lives, something that had long been absent in the Blackwood mansion. Upstairs, Claire was throwing her few clothes into an old suitcase, her hands trembling so much she could barely fold the pieces. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to stop to wipe them away. She needed to leave before she lost her courage. A soft knock on the door made her freeze. Claire? It was Edward's voice, low and pleading. Please, can we talk? There's nothing to talk about, Mr. Blackwood. She replied, proud that her voice came out steady despite the turmoil in her chest. Claire, please. The pain in his voice was palpable. We can't end like this. End what? She wanted to scream. Something that had never really begun? A foolish dream of a naive girl who fell in love with her boss? It's already over, she replied, continuing to pack her suitcase. Your wife made that very clear. On the other side of the door, Edward rested his forehead against the cold wood. What if I told you she's wrong? That what I feel for you is real? Claire stopped, her hands gripping a blouse so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Please, don't do this. Don't make everything even more difficult. Difficult is pretending I don't feel anything when you're leaving. His voice was laden with emotion. Difficult is knowing I'll never see your smile in the garden again, never hear your stories in the library, never again. Stop, Claire shouted, finally letting the tears flow freely. You have a family, a wife, a wonderful daughter. I won't be the person who destroys all that. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire could hear Edward's heavy breathing on the other side of the door, could almost feel his presence through the wood that separated them. What if it was already destroyed? He finally asked, his voice just a whisper. What if you were the only true thing amid so many lies? Claire closed her eyes tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. How could he say these things? How could he make everything even more impossible? "Goodbye, Mr. Blackwood," she answered, each word costing a piece of her soul. On the other side of the door, Edward felt something inside him break. It wasn't just his heart. It was his last chance at redemption, his last opportunity to feel something real after years of living a charade. Heather observed the scene from the end of the hallway, a glass of whiskey in hand and a satisfied smile on her lips. Her plan had worked perfectly, but there was something in her eyes, a shadow of doubt perhaps, as if she too felt she was destroying something precious. Isabella, who had followed her father to Claire's room, hugged her stuffed rabbit tightly, large silent tears streaming down her face. Her little world was crumbling, and she didn't understand why. When Claire finally opened the door, suitcase in hand, she found only the empty hallway. Edward had gone, leaving only the echo of his words in the air. She descended the stairs like a ghost, each step taking her further from the only place where she had truly felt at home. In the entrance hall, she briefly stopped to look around one last time. The walls that once seemed cold and imposing now held precious memories. Isabella's laughter echoing through the corridors, stories told by candlelight in the library, glances exchanged with Edward that said more than 1,000 words. That's when she noticed something on the floor, a single daisy still in bud, pulled from the garden. Next to it, a drawing by Isabella, 3 smiling stick figures, her father and Claire, surrounded by flowers. Claire felt her heart break once more. She picked up the drawing with trembling hands and put it in her bag, along with the daisy. They would be her only physical reminders of this dream she should never have dreamed. From his office, Edward watched through the window as Claire crossed the garden for the last time. She didn't look back, but he could see her shoulders trembling, with suppressed sobs. When she finally disappeared through the gate, he allowed himself to do something he hadn't done in years. He cried. What none of them knew was that this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. Because some stories don't end with a goodbye, some flowers need to die before being reborn stronger, and some loves are too great to be contained by social conventions or mansion walls. In the library, the storybook that Claire used to read to Isabella remained open on the last page they had read together. It was a tale about an impossible love that, in the end, found its way. The irony didn't escape Edward when, hours later, he found the book and read the last line. Because true love, like the most resilient flowers, finds ways to bloom even in the most unlikely terrain. And in the garden, ignoring the drama of the adults, the daisy buds continued, their inevitable journey toward the sun, ready to bloom in their own time, following their own pace as true love always does. The days following Claire's departure were like a symphony in minor tones at the Blackwood mansion. Heather resumed her social routine as if nothing had happened, but her eyes betrayed a constant vigilance over her husband. Edward immersed himself in work with an almost feverish intensity, arriving home later and later. And Isabella stopped smiling. The new nanny, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Matthews, was competent and professional, but there were no magical stories, no games in the garden, none of that special light that Claire brought with her. The daisies had finally bloomed, but there was no one to celebrate with Isabella. On a particularly difficult afternoon, when Isabella's screams echoed through the mansion, "I want Claire! I want Claire!" Edward found himself driving aimlessly through the city. His car took him, as if it had a mind of its own, to the working-class neighborhood where he knew Claire lived. He stopped in front of a small apartment building, his Porsche completely out of place in the modest neighborhood. For almost an hour, he sat there watching the windows, imagining behind which of them Claire might be. Was she thinking of him too, feeling the same excruciating pain in her chest? That's when he noticed movement on the sidewalk, a familiar figure carrying grocery bags. His heart stopped for a second when he recognized Maria, the mansion's former cook who had retired a few years ago, and she was talking to none other than Claire. Edward watched, paralyzed, as the two women entered the building. His mind began to work furiously. Maria had always been more than an employee. She was almost a second mother to him, having worked for the Blackwood family since Edward was a child. Without thinking twice, He got out of the car and crossed the street. At the intercom, he pressed Maria's apartment, praying she still lived in the same place he remembered from his occasional visits. "Who is it?" Maria's familiar voice sounded through the intercom. "Maria, it's me, Edward." A long silence followed, broken only by the buzz of the door being unlocked. In the small third-floor apartment, Edward found Maria alone. Claire had obviously left upon learning of his arrival. The apartment smelled of freshly brewed coffee and rain cookies, exactly how the mansion's kitchen used to smell in Maria's time. "My boy," Maria greeted him with that look that mixed affection and disapproval. "What are you doing here?" Edward collapsed into a kitchen chair, feeling the weight of the last few days on his shoulders. "Is she okay, Maria? Please, I need to know." Maria sighed, serving him a cup of coffee. "How do you think she is, Edward? The girl is destroyed, but she's moving forward as strong people do. I need to talk to her." He held the cup tightly, as if he could find answers in the dark liquid. "For what?" Maria asked softly. "To make everything even more difficult. She's trying to rebuild her life. Got a new job in a daycare." Edward closed his eyes. The image of Claire telling stories to other children making his chest hurt. Isabella won't stop crying for her. The house seems dead without her, Maria. And Heather. His wife's name in Maria's voice sounded like a gentle accusation. "How is she?" As always, Edward laughed humorlessly. "Perfect, controlled, cold." Maria sat across from him, her wise eyes studying his face. "Do you remember what I always said when you were a boy? That sometimes we need to lose something precious to understand its true value." "But I already understand the value, Maria." His voice came out choked. "I understand perfectly what I lost." "No, my son." Maria took his hand across the table. "You understand what Claire meant to you, but have you stopped to think about what you mean to her? What your indecision is doing to that young heart?" The words hit Edward like a punch. He had never really considered the other side. He was so caught up in his own pain, his own internal struggle, that he hadn't truly thought about what Claire was going through. "She left this for you." Maria stood up and went to a small sideboard, returning with an envelope. "She asked me to give it to you if you showed up." Edward took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, there was only a piece of paper with a few words written in Claire's delicate handwriting. "Some stories aren't meant to have a happy ending. Some flowers need to be picked before they fully bloom. Take good care of the daisies. They're stronger than they seem. And please, tell Isabella she will always be my story, princess. C." A tear fell on the paper, slightly blurring the ink. Edward carefully folded the letter and put it in his pocket, close to his heart. "She's living with her sister in Atlanta," Maria said softly. "She left last night." The news hit Edward like lightning. Atlanta, on the other side of the country. Too far for furtive visits, too far for casual encounters, too far for any hope. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Because you need to understand that it's over, my child," Maria replied gently. "Sometimes true love isn't about staying together. It's about letting go." Edward stood up, his legs wobbly. Before leaving, he stopped at the door and turned to Maria. Do you think I should go after her?" Maria smiled sadly. "I think you already know the answer, Edward. The question is, are you ready to accept the consequences of that decision?" He left Maria's apartment with more questions than answers, but with a certainty growing in his chest. He couldn't continue living a lie. Something had to change. What Edward didn't know was that, at that exact moment, Heather was in her private office at the mansion, looking at an envelope very similar to the one he had just received. But the contents of this one were very different. They were photos taken that same afternoon, showing his car parked in the working-class neighborhood. And along with the photos, there was a detailed report on Claire's whereabouts in Atlanta. Heather smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So you want to play, Edward? Let's play." She picked up her phone and dialed a number. "Hello, I need a ticket to Atlanta, immediately." The humid heat of Atlanta embraced Heather as soon as she stepped off the plane. Impeccably dressed in a designer suit, she stood out completely from the tropical and relaxed environment of the airport. Her driver was already waiting, previously hired along with a local investigator who had located the exact address of Mary, Claire's sister. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Edward faced his own inner storm. The sudden absence of Heather, who claimed an emergency trip to visit a sick aunt, left him restless. His wife had never been one to make impulsive moves. Each of her actions was always calculated, always part of a bigger plan. "Daddy," Isabella called during breakfast, her small voice carrying a wisdom beyond her years. "Why did Mommy go on a trip just when the daisies are all blooming?" Edward swallowed hard, observing his daughter. The flowers in the garden had indeed fully bloomed, forming a white and golden carpet that seemed to mock his pain. Each petal was a reminder of Claire, each scent a memory of what could have been. "Sometimes, Princess, adults need to do things that don't make much sense," he replied, realizing the irony of his own words. In Atlanta, Heather approached her objective. The neighborhood where Mary lived was simple but pleasant, with colorful houses and leafy trees providing shade against the relentless sun. Her car stopped in front of a light blue house where children played on the sidewalk. That's when she saw her. Claire was sitting on the porch, reading a story to a small group of children surrounding her, completely absorbed in her narrative. There was something different about her, a serenity that Heather didn't recognize from the mansion days. "Snow White bit the apple and fell into a deep sleep," Claire read, making different voices for each character, exactly as she used to do for Isabella. "But do you know what happened? To next, the prince's kiss," one of the children shouted enthusiastically. Claire smiled, that smile that Heather so despised for its genuineness. "That's right, because true love is stronger than any curse." Heather felt something strange in her chest. Could it be guilt? She quickly pushed the feeling away. She was there with a purpose. She got out of the car and walked to the gate, her high heels echoing on the pavement. The children were the first to notice her, their curious gazes fixed on the elegant and out-of-place figure she represented. Claire looked up from the book and froze. The color drained from her face, and the book slipped from her hands, falling with a dull thud on the porch floor. "Mrs. Blackwood?" Her voice trembled slightly. What are you doing here?" Heather put on her best social smile. "Dear, we need to talk, in private." The children, sensing the tension in the air, began to slowly disperse. Claire stood up, her legs wobbly. "Mary!" she called, and her sister appeared at the door, stopping abruptly upon seeing Heather. "Take care of the children for a moment?" Claire asked, her eyes pleading for understanding. Mary nodded, casting a suspicious look at Heather before gathering the children and taking them inside. "We can talk in the backyard," Claire suggested, her voice regaining some firmness. Heather followed her, observing how the place, though simple, had touches of Claire everywhere. Vases with flowers, stacked books, children's drawings on the walls. It was a real home, not a showcase of perfection like the Blackwood mansion. In the small garden, protected from the sun by an old mango tree, the two women faced each other. Heather noticed that Claire seemed thinner, paler, but there was a dignity in her posture that hadn't existed before. "I came to make a proposal," Heather began, getting straight to the point. "How much do you want?" Claire blinked, confused. "What?" "Money, dear." Heather opened her designer purse and took out a checkbook. "Name your amount. In exchange, you sign a document committing to never again approach my family." The initial shock on Claire's face was replaced by something else. Indignation, perhaps, or pity. "You really don't understand, do you?" Claire spoke softly. "It's not about money. It never was. Everything is about money, dear." Heather laughed, a humorless sound. "Only some people are honest enough to admit it." "Like you?" Claire shot back, surprising herself with her boldness. "Is that why you stay with Mr. Blackwood, for money?" It was Heather's turn to pale. "You know nothing about my marriage." "I know enough to realize there's no love there." Claire took a step forward. "And you know what's saddest, Mrs. Blackwood? You're so used to buying everything you want that you've forgotten some things are priceless." "Like love?" Heather mocked. but there was a note of uncertainty in her voice. Like happiness, Claire corrected gently. Like a child's genuine smile. Like the peace of sleeping at night knowing you haven't destroyed anyone's life. The words hit Heather more deeply than she would like to admit. For a moment, very brief, her mask of perfection cracked, revealing something vulnerable underneath. He's suffering, Heather said abruptly. Edward. He doesn't sleep, barely eats. Isabella cries every night. Claire felt her heart tighten. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to understand what you caused. Heather put away the checkbook, her voice taking on a different tone. You entered our lives like a hurricane, messed everything up, and now you're here. Trying to fix things with money, Claire completed. But have you ever stopped to think that maybe some things really need to be messed up in order to be truly fixed? The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken truths. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the mango tree, bringing the sweet scent of the garden flowers. He will come after you, Heather finally spoke, her voice almost a whisper. When he finds out where you are, he will come. No, he won't, Claire smiled sadly. Because he's an honorable man, and honorable men don't abandon their families. Heather studied the young face before her, seeing for the first time not a threat, but a woman who carried her own pain with dignity. And if he comes, she asked, surprising herself. Then I will send him back myself, Claire replied firmly, because some stories need to end so that others can begin. Heather nodded slowly, as if finally understanding something important. Without saying anything more, she turned to leave. At the garden door, she stopped. You know what's ironic? She said without turning around. The daisies you planted. They're more beautiful than any flower that has ever grown in that garden. When Heather left, Claire collapsed into a garden chair, silent tears streaming down her face. Mary appeared soon after, wrapping her sister in a tight hug. It will pass, Mary whispered, stroking her sister's hair. Everything passes. What neither of them knew was that, at that exact moment, Edward was in his office in Chicago, looking at a plane ticket to Atlanta on his computer, his finger hovering over the buy button. Some decisions once made cannot be undone, and some stories, no matter how hard we try to avoid it, need to follow their course to the end. The flight back to Chicago was torture for Heather. Each minute in the air was a moment of forced reflection. Each mile traveled an opportunity to question her own actions. The image of Claire in the simple Atlanta garden, surrounded by children and telling stories, wouldn't leave her mind. There was a peace there, an authenticity that the Blackwood mansion, with all its luxury and ostentation, had never known. When the plane landed, it was already night in Chicago. Heather found the mansion silent, except for the low sound coming from Edward's office. She stopped at the door, watching her husband bent over the computer, his face illuminated by the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as if he were waging an internal battle. Don't do it, she said softly, making him jump in surprise. Edward quickly closed the laptop screen, but not before Heather saw the airline website. You were in Atlanta. It wasn't a question. Yes. Heather entered the office, serving herself a glass of whiskey. And before you ask, yes, I saw her. Edward stood up abruptly, his hands trembling. How is she? Is she... She's fine. Heather interrupted him, her voice surprisingly gentle. Better than any of us, actually. The silence that followed was deafening. Years of unspoken words, of accumulated hurt, of love transformed into social convenience, all weighing between them like an invisible wall. Why did you go there? Edward finally asked. Heather took a long sip of her drink before answering. To protect what's mine, or what I thought was mine. And what did you discover? That perhaps... She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Perhaps some things cannot be possessed, only felt. Edward stared at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. It was the first time in years he had seen anything beyond the mask of perfection in his wife. Heather... No. She raised her hand, preventing him from continuing. Let me finish. I went there to buy her off, to permanently remove her from our lives. I offered money, a lot of money. Edward felt his stomach turn. You what? And do you know what she did? Heather laughed, a bitter sound. She refused, not only refused, but made me see something I've been ignoring for years. What? That our marriage died long before Claire appeared in our lives. Heather turned to the window, observing the garden illuminated by the moon. The daisies you planted, they bloomed. Edward, they're more alive and more beautiful than anything that has ever grown in this garden. Do you know why? Edward didn't answer, but his heart was pounding in his chest. Because they were planted with love. Heather continued, her voice choked. Not with obligation, not with appearances, but with true love. The kind of love I don't know if I ever really felt, or allowed myself to feel. What are you saying, Heather? She turned to face him, unshed, tears shining in her eyes. I'm saying I'm tired. Tired of pretending, of controlling, of living a life that seems like an expensive store window, beautiful on the outside, empty inside. And Isabella? Edward asked, his voice trembling. Isabella deserves happy parents, even if that means separated parents. Heather wiped away a solitary tear that escaped. Have you seen her in the last few months? How she wilted, how her smiles disappeared. We can't keep doing this to her. Edward sank into his chair, the weight of Heather's words pressing on his chest. So that's it? After 15 years? 15 years of a marriage that turned into a social contract, Heather completed. But you know what's worse? It's not even the end of our marriage that scares me. It's realizing that I don't feel the pain I should feel, only relief. Silence filled the office again, but this time it was different. It was no longer suffocating, but liberating, as if a long-buried truth could finally breathe. She loves you, you know, Heather said softly. The kind of love I used to dream about when I was young. The kind of love that makes someone give up everything not to hurt others. Edward closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those words. She said that? She didn't need to say it. Heather smiled sadly. It was in her eyes, in the way she spoke about you, about Isabella, in the way she refused to be the reason for a family's destruction. And now? Now? Heather placed her empty glass on the desk. Now you have a choice to make, but this time, do it for love, not out of obligation. She walked to the door, stopping before leaving. Oh, and Edward, if you decide to go to Atlanta, tell her I'm sorry for everything. Heather left the office, leaving Edward alone with his thoughts and the computer still open on the airline tickets page. In the garden, the daisies swayed, gently in the night breeze, their white petals shining under the moonlight like little stars fallen from the sky. In her room, Isabella slept hugging the storybook that Claire used to read, her dreams populated by princesses who found their happy endings and flowers that never stopped growing. And perhaps, just perhaps, a child's dreams were wiser than all the social conventions of the adult world. The next morning dawned with a fine rain in Chicago, the kind of drizzle that seems more like a curtain of memories than actual water. Edward hadn't slept. He spent the entire night in his office, alternating between looking at the plane ticket on his computer and the family photos scattered on the wall, frozen moments of a happiness that, he now realized, had long been mere pretense. Heather had moved to the guest room during the night, taking only the essentials. The sound of her drawers being emptied echoed through the mansion like a requiem for 15 years of marriage. Neither of them cried, perhaps because there were no more. Tears for a love that had died so gradually they hadn't even noticed its last breath. It was Isabella who first broke the silence that morning, entering her father's office still in pajamas, her stuffed rabbit dragging on the floor. Daddy, why is Mommy in the other room? Edward felt his heart tighten. How to explain to a 5-year-old child that sometimes love ends, that sometimes people who promise to stay together forever discover that forever can have an expiration date? Come here, princess. He picked her up, smelling the soft scent of children's shampoo in her hair. Sometimes, even when people like each other very much, they need time apart to be happier. Like when Claire left? The innocent question? hit Edward like an arrow. It's different, sweetheart. But did Claire also leave to make us happier? Isabella insisted, her large eyes full of a wisdom that broke Edward's heart. Because we're not happier, Daddy. Not one bit. Edward hugged his daughter tightly, feeling tears he didn't know he still had stream down his face. No, princess. Sometimes adults make mistakes, big mistakes. Upstairs, Heather watched the rain through the guest room window. Her suitcase was already partially packed, expensive clothes and carefully selected jewelry for her new life. But it was the objects she wasn't taking that weighed more. The family photos, the wedding anniversary gifts, the small mementos of a life that now seemed to have belonged to someone else. Her phone vibrated. It was her lawyer, confirming the meeting to discuss the terms of the divorce. Everything would be done discreetly, of course. Chicago high society didn't need another scandal to comment on at their dinners. In the garden, the daisies bent slightly under the drizzle, their white petals dotted with raindrops like frozen tears. Edward was watching them through the office window, Isabella still in his lap when Heather entered. "We need to talk to her," Heather said softly. Together. Edward nodded and the three sat on the office carpet, one last attempt to look like a normal family, even if it was to say they would no longer be a family as before. "Isabella, dear," Heather began, her voice softer than Edward had heard in years. "Sometimes when two people grow up, they grow in different directions, like plants that look for the sun on opposite sides of the garden." "Like Claire's daisies?" Isabella asked, clutching her rabbit. Heather swallowed hard before continuing. "Yes, like the daisies. Your father and I, we still love you very much. That will never change, but we won't be living together anymore." "Because of Claire?" "No, my love." It was Edward who answered, surprising Heather. "Claire just helped us see something that had been happening for a long time. Will she come back?" The hope in Isabella's voice made Heather's heart tighten in a way she hadn't expected. "That," Heather looked at Edward, "that depends on your father." Edward stared at his still wife, shocked by her words. Heather smiled sadly. "What are you waiting for, Edward? Life is too short to live with regrets." "But what about you and Isabella?" "I'll be fine." Heather gently touched her daughter's face. "And Isabella deserves to see her father happy, truly happy." "And the daisies?" Isabella asked, her childish concern for the flowers drawing sad smiles from her parents. "The daisies will keep growing, my love," Heather replied, surprising herself with the sincerity in her voice. "Sometimes the most beautiful things are born after the storm." That afternoon, while Heather organized her move and Isabella played under Mrs. Matthews's care, Edward finally clicked the buy button for the Atlanta ticket. His hands were trembling, but his heart was lighter than it had been in months. In Tijuas, the garden. The rain had stopped, and the daisies rose again toward the sun, stronger after the storm, as if they knew in their silent wisdom as flowers that sometimes the rain needs to fall for new stories to bloom. In Atlanta, Claire was watching a rainbow form in the sky after a tropical rain, not knowing that her own son was on its way. Because some stories, no matter how hard we try to avoid them, have their own way of finding their true ending. And sometimes the true ending is just a new beginning in disguise. The heat of Atlanta hit Edward like a wave as soon as he left. The airport. Unlike Heather, who had arrived prepared and impeccable, he seemed out of place in his dark suit, the tie already loose around his neck. In his hand, he carried only a small suitcase and something precious, a daisy bud that Isabella had insisted on giving him before he left. "For good luck, Daddy," she had said, her eyes shining with a wisdom beyond her years. And so Claire doesn't forget our garden. Now standing in front of the light blue house his driver had just identified, Edward felt the weight of that single flower bud in his pocket. The voices of children playing in the yard reached him, mixed with the unmistakable sound of Claire telling a story. And then the prince realized that sometimes we need to lose something precious to understand its true value, she read, her voice carrying an emotion that made Edward's heart skip a beat. He remained there outside the gate, just listening. How could he simply enter and interrupt that moment? How could he appear after so long and expect her to welcome him back into her life? That's when a soccer ball escaped through the gate, rolling to his feet. A boy of about 6 came running to retrieve it, stopping when he saw the stranger in a suit. "Mister, are you lost?" the boy asked, picking up his ball. Edward smiled, suddenly feeling nervous. "No, actually, I came to see Claire." "Aunt Claire," the boy shouted before Edward could stop him. "There's a man in a suit here looking for you." The silence that followed was deafening. The story stopped in the middle, and Edward heard the sound of a book being closed. Soft footsteps approached the gate, and then she was there, less than 2 meters from him. Claire looked different, thinner, more tanned by the Atlanta sun, her hair longer than he remembered. But her eyes were the same ones that haunted him in his dreams. "Edward?" Her voice was just a whisper. What are you doing here?" He took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "I needed to see you. I needed to tell you a story." The children, sensing that something important was happening, began to approach curiously. Mary appeared on the porch, her eyes widening when she recognized Edward. "Children, snack time," she called, understanding that the two needed privacy. When they were finally alone, the silence between them seemed dense enough to be touched. "Heather was here," Claire finally said, her fingers nervously playing with the hem of her dress. "So no," Edward responded softly. "She was the one who encouraged me to come." Claire blinked, confused. "How?" "We separated, Claire." The words came out easier than he expected. "In fact, I think we had been separated for a long time. We just didn't have the courage to admit it." "Edward." She took a step back, as if his words were something physical that could hurt her. "Please don't do this. Don't give me hopes that—" "Hopes," he interrupted her, his voice trembling with emotion. "You are my only hope, Claire. The only real thing that happened in my life in recent years." Tears began to stream down her face. "And Isabella, how is she?" Edward took the daisy bud from his pocket, extending it to her. "She sent this. Said it's so you don't forget our garden." Claire took the flower with trembling hands, a sob escaping her lips. "The daisies. Did they bloom?" "More beautiful than any flower that has ever grown in that garden." He took another step toward her. "But something is missing in them. The person who planted them with love is missing, who taught my daughter to see magic in the simplest things, who made me believe there was still hope for a heart I thought was dead. You can't just show up here and—" Claire began, but her voice failed when Edward touched her face, wiping her tears with his thumb. "Can't I?" he asked softly. "Then tell me to leave. Tell me you don't feel the same, that you don't dream of me every night like I dream of you. Tell me you don't want to try, that you don't want to see if this story can have a different ending." Claire closed her eyes, feeling his touch on her face. "What if it doesn't work? What if it does?" Edward countered. "What if it's exactly as it should have been from the beginning? You and I raising Isabella together, planting our own garden, writing our own story." "It's not that simple." "No, it's not," he agreed. "It will be difficult. There will be bad days. There will be people who won't understand. But for the first time in my life, I'm willing to fight for what really matters. Not for what others expect of me, not for the appearance of perfection, but for true love." Claire opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "True love. Like in the fairy tales I read to Isabella." Edward smiled, that smile she had missed so much. "Better, like in real-life stories, where love needs to be cultivated every day like the daisies in the garden." At that moment, a gentle breeze passed by them, carrying the scent of the yard flowers. The daisy bud in Claire's hand seemed to pulse with its own life, as if it too wanted to be part of that story. "Are you sure?" she asked one last time, her voice barely passing a whisper. In response, Edward did something he had dreamed of doing since that first interview in his office. He leaned in and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, full of promises and possibilities, a kiss that spoke of second chances and new beginnings. When they separated, Claire was smiling through her tears. "This isn't exactly how it ends in fairy tales. You—" "So no," Edward agreed, pulling her closer. It's better, because it's real. From across the street, Mary observed the scene through the window, a satisfied smile on her face. She picked up her phone and quickly typed a message to Heather. They deserve this chance. Thank you for understanding. In Chicago, Heather read the message while watching Isabella playing in the garden among the daisies. A sad but serene smile played on her lips. Sometimes we need to lose something for others to find their happiness, she murmured to herself, watching her daughter make a new crown of flowers. And sometimes only then do we find our own peace. The decision to return to Chicago wasn't easy for Claire. She had built a life in Atlanta, a small world of stories and children's smiles that had helped heal her broken heart. The children in the neighborhood cried when they learned of her departure, especially when she read them one last story, coincidentally about a princess who needed to be brave to find her true happiness. Edward spent 3 days in Atlanta, getting to know the simple but happy life Claire had built. He stayed at the small hotel nearby, but spent his days at the light blue house watching her with the children, learning about a side of life that his world of luxury and appearances had never allowed him to know. Are you sure you want to trade? All this for the madness that will be facing Chicago high society? He asked one night as they walked along the beach. Claire stopped, looking at the sea reflecting the city lights. I'm not returning for Chicago high society, Edward. I'm returning for you, for Isabella, for our chance to be a real family. The two. Word family made Edward's heart race. It was strange how something that had always been a social obligation now sounded like a promise of happiness. On the day of departure, Mary hugged her sister tightly. This time, she whispered, go after your happiness without fear. You deserve it. The flight back was quiet, their hands intertwined, saying more than words could express. But the real test would come when they landed in Chicago, where reality awaited them with all its challenges. Heather had kept her word. She was temporarily living in her apartment in Lakeshore Drive, leaving the mansion ready to receive Claire. But it wasn't to the mansion that Edward drove first. Where are we going? Claire asked, noticing they were following a different path. To pick up someone who is dying to see you. Claire's heart raced as she recognized Isabella's school. The little girl was in the yard playing distractedly with other children when she saw them. For a moment she froze, as if not believing her eyes. Claire! Isabella's scream echoed through the yard as she ran, her small arms soon wrapping around her former nanny's waist with all the strength she had. My little princess. Claire knelt down, hugging Isabella as tears streamed down her face. You've grown. The daisies grew too, Isabella talked non-stop, excited. And I take care of them every day, just like you taught me. And I kept all the storybooks in the library, just the way you like. And Edward observed the scene with a full heart. It was as if a piece that was missing from their lives had finally returned to its place. But not everything would be so simple. Upon arriving at the mansion, Claire stopped at the entrance, hesitant. The last time she had been there had been under such different circumstances. Welcome back, a familiar voice surprised her. Heather was standing at the door, as elegant as ever, but there was something different in her eyes, a kind of peace that didn't exist before. Mrs. Blackwood, Claire began, but Heather interrupted her. Heather, please, I think we've moved past the formalities. She approached, surprising everyone with a quick but sincere hug for Claire. Take good care of them. They need you more than I was ever able to admit. Isabella observed the scene with wide eyes, trying to process this new dynamic between the three most important people in her life. Edward placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder, feeling her confusion. Sometimes, princess, he explained. Softly, families change shape so everyone can be happier. Like clouds, Isabella asked, making everyone smile at her innocent analogy. Exactly like clouds, Heather agreed, surprising herself with the wisdom found in childish simplicity. That night, after Heather left and Isabella finally fell asleep, not without first demanding 3 different stories from Claire, the couple walked to the garden. The daisies shone under the moonlight, more abundant and beautiful than ever. They waited for you, Edward said softly, embracing Claire from behind as they observed the flowers. How are you so sure? Because I waited too. He turned her to face him. his eyes reflecting all the love they felt. "And now that you're back, we can finally begin our own story." Claire smiled, that smile that had enchanted Edward from the first day. "Do you know what the best part of real-life stories is?" "What?" "That they don't need a traditional happily ever after. They can have ups and downs, they can have difficult chapters, but they continue to be written every day with true love." Edward kissed her under the moonlight, among the daisies that had witnessed the beginning of their love. It was a kiss of promise, of new beginning, of hope. But even they couldn't imagine the challenges that were still to come. Because Chicago, high society doesn't easily forgive those who defy its conventions, and some secrets from the past were about to emerge, testing the strength of this love that had overcome so many obstacles. In Heather's office, an old folder waited, containing information about Claire's past that not even she knew, and somewhere in Ohio, Peter, Claire's brother, received a mysterious call that would make him question everything he knew about his own family. The daisies continued to bloom in the garden, oblivious to the human dramas unfolding around them. But perhaps they knew in their silent wisdom as flowers that some stories need to face a few more storms before finding their true peace. The phone call Peter received at his mechanic shop in Ohio would change everything. The voice on the other end of the line was grave, laden with an urgency that made his heart tighten. "Mr. Peter Oliveira, I'm attorney Henry Morgan. We need to talk about your sister Claire and about your true family." Meanwhile, in Chicago, life seemed to finally find its rhythm at the Blackwood mansion. Claire had transformed the old servants' wing into a small storytelling space where neighborhood children came twice a week to hear her magical narratives. It was her way of keeping alive the spirit of the work she had done in Atlanta. Edward watched with pride how she balanced her new life. She was a companion, confidant, still a maternal figure for Isabella, but also her own person, with her own dreams and projects. The love between them blossomed stronger, truer with each day. But Chicago high society wasn't so quick to forgive. The whispers at social events, the sidelong glances, the doors that began to close for Edward were just the beginning. "Did you see? He traded Heather for the nanny. I heard she's a gold digger. Poor Heather, always so elegant." The malicious comments reached Claire's ears like small stabs. She kept her head high, but Edward noticed how each word hurt her. "Don't listen to them," he would say, embracing her on nights when he found her crying silently in the library. "They don't know our love, our truth." It was on one of these nights that Heather appeared without warning. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she held an old folder. "We need to talk," she said, looking directly at Claire. "All of us." In the office, Heather placed the folder on the desk. "Before opening this, I want you to know that I investigated more deeply, not out of malice, but something didn't fit in the Oliveira family story." Claire felt her stomach turn. "What are you talking about?" "Your birth certificate," Heather began softly, "is fake." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward took Claire's hand, feeling it tremble. "What do you mean, fake?" Claire whispered. "You're not the Oliveira's daughter, Claire. You are..." Heather hesitated. "You are a Morgan." The world seemed to spin around Claire. Morgan, the same surname as the family with whom Edward was negotiating the merger of his companies. "That's impossible," she stammered. "Your biological mother was Beatrice Morgan, younger sister of Richard Morgan," Heather continued, her voice surprisingly gentle. "She died in childbirth, and your father, well, your biological father was married to someone else. To avoid scandal, you were given to the Oliveira family, who at the time worked for the Morgans." Edward let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "The Morgans, all this time." "They don't know," Heather completed. "Or at least they pretend not to know. But Richard, your biological uncle, began to suspect when he saw your photo in the newspapers. You're identical to Beatrice." Claire stood up abruptly, her legs wobbly. "So my whole life at my family was a lie." "No," Edward held her before she fell. "The Oliveira's love for you was never a lie. They raised you, loved you." "Peter," Claire murmured. He's coming to Chicago. He received a call. From the Morgan's lawyer, Heather completed. They want to resolve this. Officially. The implications of that revelation were overwhelming. Claire wasn't just the ex-nanny who had won Edward. Blackwood's heart. She was a Morgan, heir to one of Chicago's most traditional families. "Why are you telling us this?" Edward asked Heather, still holding Claire in his arms. Heather smiled sadly. "Because you deserve to face this together, with the full truth in your hands, and because," she hesitated, "because maybe that way society will stop judging your love as a scandal and start seeing it as destiny acting in mysterious ways." At that moment, as if the universe wanted to add another layer of complexity to the situation, Isabella appeared at the office door, her sleepy eyes. "Claire, do you promise you won't leave again?" The childish voice carried a fear that broke everyone's hearts. Claire knelt down, opening her arms to the girl. "Come here, my princess. Let me tell you a story about a girl who discovered that family isn't just the one we're born into, but also the one we choose with our hearts." As Claire hugged Isabella, Edward and Heather exchanged a significant look. The truth about Claire's past would change many things, but there was one certainty that remained unshakable. The love that united that unlikely family was stronger than any family tree. In the garden, the daisies continued their eternal cycle of blooming, as silent witnesses that sometimes the most beautiful stories are written not by blood, but by the heart. And somewhere in Ohio, Peter Oliveira was packing his bags, preparing to face a truth that would change not only his sister's life, but the entire balance of power in Chicago high society. Fate, in its infinite irony, had transformed the nanny. Everyone judged into an heiress no one expected. But would this new status be enough to protect Edward and Claire's love? Or would this revelation bring even more storms to their garden of daisies? The arrival of Peter in Chicago was like the harbinger of a storm. He parked his beat-up pickup truck in front of the imposing Blackwood mansion. The contrast between his world and his sister's never more evident than at that moment. In his hands, he carried an old wooden box that his mother, or the woman he had always believed to be his mother, had given him before she died. One day, she had said, "Claire will need to know the truth, and when that day comes, give this to her." Claire was waiting for him in the garden, among the daisies that now looked like a white and golden carpet. Upon seeing her brother, she ran into his arms, tears already streaming down her face. "Peter," she sobbed, clinging to him as when they were children. "Hey, little one." He hugged her tight, his voice choked. "Looks like we have a lot to talk about, huh?" Edward observed the scene from the porch, respecting the moment between the siblings. Or would they be adoptive siblings now? The definitions of family seemed increasingly fluid, more complex. In the library, Peter opened the wooden box. Inside, there were letters, old photos, and a diary. Claire's hands trembled as she picked up the first photograph. A young, beautiful woman with her same large eyes smiled at the camera. "Beatrice Morgan," Peter explained softly. "Our mother. I mean your biological mother." Claire traced the outline of the face in the photo with her fingers. "Why did they never tell us?" "Mom, Rosa, wanted to tell you when you turned 18. But Dad, he was afraid of losing you to the Morgans. You two had such a special bond." Edward approached, placing a comforting hand on Claire's shoulder as she read the first letter. It was from Beatrice to her unborn daughter. "My little one. If you're reading this, it means I couldn't be by your side to watch you grow, but I want you to know that you were conceived with so much love. A forbidden love, it's true, but no less real because of it. Your father couldn't claim you. Circumstances, society, everything conspired against us. But I found a wonderful family who promised to love you as their own daughter. The Oliveiras are simple people, but they have hearts bigger than any Morgan fortune." Tears blurred Claire's vision as she read. Edward hugged her tighter, feeling her body tremble with suppressed sobs. "There's more," Peter said, picking up a sealed envelope. "This is from the Morgan's lawyer. They want to meet you, Claire. They want to officially recognize you as an heiress." "No." Claire's response was immediate. surprising everyone. "I don't want any inheritance. My family is the Oliveras. It's you, Peter and Mary, and our parents who raised me with true love. But Claire," Edward gently intervened, "this would change everything. The society that judges you so much." "That's exactly why," she turned to face him. "I don't want them to accept our love because they discovered I have noble blood. I want them to accept it because it's genuine, because it's real." Peter smiled, recognizing in his sister the same strength their mother Rosa always had. "Mum would say you're more Olivera than many Oliveras by birth." At that moment, Isabella came running into the library, stopping when she saw Peter. "Are you Uncle Peter? Claire always tells stories about you." Peter's smile widened as he picked the girl up. "And you must be the little princess from the stories my sister talks about so much." "Your sister?" Isabella wrinkled her forehead, confused. "But isn't Claire not your sister anymore?" The adults exchanged emotional looks. How to explain to a child the complexities of family love? "You know, Princess," Peter began, sitting down with her, "sometimes families are like a garden. Some flowers were born together, others were planted later, but all are part of the same garden. And the most important thing isn't how they got there, but the love that makes them grow together." Claire felt her heart expand with love for her brother. He had always known how to find the right words, even in the most difficult situations. "Like the daisies," Isabella exclaimed. "They're a family too, aren't they?" "Yes, my love," Claire replied, taking the girl from her brother's arms. "And you know something. It doesn't matter what papers or blood say. You, your father, Uncle Peter, Aunt Mary, you are my family, the family my heart chose." Edward watched the scene with teary eyes. How did this woman manage to transform each difficult moment into a lesson in love? But the peace of that moment would be brief. Outside the mansion, an elegant car was parking. Richard Morgan, the powerful patriarch of the family, was coming personally to meet the niece fate had returned to him, and with him came an even more shocking revelation, one that would change not only Claire's future, but also her understanding of the past. The daisies in the garden swayed with the afternoon breeze, their white petals reflecting the sun like tiny mirrors of truth. Because sometimes truth, like the most resilient flowers, finds its way to the light no matter how long it has remained buried in darkness. The meeting between Claire and Richard Morgan was like the collision of two different worlds. He was tall, imposing, with perfectly groomed grey hair and a suit that probably cost more than all the furniture in the house where Claire grew up. But it was his eyes that made her stop. They were the same large, expressive eyes she saw every morning in the mirror. "You are identical to her," Richard murmured, his normally firm voice trembling slightly. "Identical to Beatrice." Edward and Peter remained close to Claire, like silent guardians. Isabella had been taken to her room by Heather, who surprisingly had appeared minutes before, as if she knew her presence would be necessary. "Why now?" Claire asked, her voice firmer than she felt. "Why after all this time?" Richard took an envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket. His hands, normally so sure when signing million-dollar contracts, trembled as he handed the document to Claire. "Because now, I can finally tell the truth. The truth about your father." Claire's heart raced. At her side, Edward squeezed her hand harder. "It wasn't a forbidden affair as everyone thought," Richard continued, his voice laden with contained emotion. "Beatrice and Albert were married. In secret, but married." "Albert?" Edward interjected, his face paling. "Albert Blackwood, my father." The silence that followed was deafening. Claire felt the world spin around her. Edward released her hand as if he had received an electric shock. "Yes," Richard confirmed, his eyes fixed on Edward. "Albert Blackwood was Claire's father, which makes you two siblings." The word left Heather's lips like a final sentence. She had returned to the library without anyone noticing. Claire staggered, being supported by Peter. Edward had retreated to the window, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. "This is impossible," he murmured. "Father would never—" "Your father was a complex man, Edward," Richard explained gently. He and Beatrice fell in love when they were young, but the families didn't approve. They married in secret, but when Beatrice got pregnant, your mother, Amanda, was also expecting you. So they chose— Edward couldn't finish the sentence. They chose to protect both children the only way they could, Richard completed. Albert stayed with Amanda and Beatrice. Beatrice chose to give her life for her daughter. She didn't die in childbirth, Heather interjected, holding another document. She took her own life after giving Claire to the Oliveras. The cry that escaped Claire's throat was of pure pain. Peter hugged her tightly, his own tears wetting his sister's hair. Edward seemed like a marble statue by the window, his face as pale as the garden daisies. All the love he felt for Claire, all the happiness of the last few months, now stained by an impossible truth to ignore. Why? Claire finally managed to speak, her eyes fixed on Richard. Why reveal this now? Why not let us be happy in our ignorance? Because you needed to know before us. Richard hesitated, before Albert's will was opened. What will? Edward turned abruptly. Your father left a letter, Edward, a letter that would only be opened when his children found true love. Heather let out a bitter laugh. What cruel irony of fate. They found each other, fell in love. And now they need to separate, Richard completed softly. No, the shout came from the library door. Isabella was there, tears running down her small face. You can't separate them. Claire is Daddy's true love. The daisies said so. Heather ran to pick up the girl, but Isabella dodged, running to Claire. You promised, the girl sobbed, clinging to Claire's skirt. You promised you wouldn't leave again. Claire knelt down, hugging Isabella as her own tears fell. My love. Sometimes. No, Isabella interrupted her. I don't want to hear about sometimes. I want you and Daddy together. I want our family. Edward finally moved from the window, approaching slowly. His face was marked by tears he hadn't realized he had shed. How? He asked, his voice hoarse. How do we move forward after this? Claire raised her eyes to him, all the love and all the pain in the world reflected in her gaze. We can't. There has to be a way. Heather surprised everyone, her voice firm. There has to be an explanation, something we're missing. Richard reached into his briefcase, pulling out another envelope. Actually, there is something else you need to see. But before he could open the envelope, a strong wind entered through the library window, scattering papers and making the curtains dance. In the garden, the daisies bent under the force of the wind, as if they too felt the pain of that revelation. And at that moment of chaos, an old photo escaped from Richard's envelope, sliding to Claire's feet. In it, a young Beatrice smiled beside a man who was not Albert Blackwood. Fate, in its infinite wisdom, or would it be cruelty, still had one more card to play in this love story that seemed impossible in so many different ways. The photo at Claire's feet would change everything once more. The man beside Beatrice was not Albert Blackwood, but had the same gentle smile that Peter had inherited from his father, the man Claire had always known as her father. I don't understand, Claire murmured, picking up the photo with trembling hands. Richard Morgan let out a heavy sigh, as if he could finally release a weight he had carried for decades. Anthony Oliveira wasn't just the Morgans' gardener, he was Beatrice's true love. The revelation hit everyone like a wave. Heather was the first to understand. So Albert wasn't— No, Richard confirmed. Albert was just a friend who tried to help my sister escape an arranged marriage. The secret marriage was a farce to protect Beatrice and Anthony, to give them time to run away together. But when my father found out— Edward approached Claire slowly, as if afraid she might disappear. So we aren't— No, Richard smiled for the first time that afternoon. You aren't siblings. You never were. Claire felt her legs weaken. Peter held her firmly, his own tears now of relief. Dad knew, he said softly. He always knew you were really his daughter. That's why he was afraid of losing you to the Morgans. But why all this confusion? Heather asked, still holding Isabella, who was watching everything with wide eyes. Why let everyone believe that Albert was the father? Because it was safer, Richard explained. "My father would never accept his daughter marrying a gardener. But an affair with Albert Blackwood that he could eventually forgive, especially with a Blackwood grandchild." "And Beatrice?" Edward asked softly. "Why did she—" "She didn't kill herself," Richard corrected, pulling a final letter from the envelope. "She ran away. With Anthony. This letter arrived for me a week after she died. They went to Portugal, lived there for years. They died together in a car accident 5 years ago." Claire sobbed, a sound that mixed pain and relief. Her parents, her real parents, had loved each other until the end, and more than that, she was truly the daughter of the man who raised her with so much love. "So," Isabella's small voice cut through the silence, "can Claire still be Daddy's true love?" Edward didn't wait another second. In 2 steps, he was beside Claire, taking her in his arms and kissing her as if his life depended on it. The kiss tasted of tears, of relief, of love that survives all storms. "It was always you," he murmured against her lips. "From the first moment, it was always you." Heather watched the scene with a serene smile. Sometimes fate has a peculiar sense of humor, making everyone believe it was impossible, just to prove that true love always finds its way. Richard approached the window, looking at the garden where the daisies danced under the now gentle breeze. Beatrice loved daisies. She said they were the most honest flowers that existed, simple, resilient, always turned toward the sun. "Like true love," Peter completed, hugging his sister and his now officially future brother-in-law. Isabella escaped from Heather's arms and ran to join the family hug. "Now our family is complete." "More than complete," Heather smiled, surprising everyone by joining the hug. "Now it's a family built with true love, not with appearances or obligations." In the months that followed, the story of love between Edward and Claire transformed into a legend in Chicago high society. No longer as a scandal, but as a tale of true love that overcame all obstacles. The wedding was celebrated in the garden, among the daisies that had witnessed the beginning of their story. Isabella threw white petals along the path, while Peter led his sister to Edward. Heather, surprising everyone, had helped organize every detail of the ceremony. "For those who don't yet know our story," Edward began his vows, his voice choked. "With emotion, they might think it's too complex, full of twists and revelations. But for me, it was always simple. It was you, it was always you." Claire, tears of happiness streaming down her face, responded, "Do you know what the best part of real-life stories is? That they don't need a traditional happily ever after. They are written every day with true love, with choices, with small moments of happiness. And I choose to write our story with you every day." At the moment they exchanged rings, the sun set on the Chicago horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. The daisies in the garden seemed to shine with their own light, as if they too were celebrating that love which, against all odds, had found its way. And so ends this story, not with a simple happily ever after, but with the promise of many chapters yet to be written. Because true love, like the most resilient daisies, continues to bloom day after day, season after season, transforming each moment into a new page of a